I mean, what if I could be Bishop Corleone? And now I'll settle for just being me, as much as I think it would be so wonderful to be Bishop Corleone, to be a better person. Because if that were actually on offer and I was giving up my life, my identity, that would be, Aristotle said, like committing suicide. I would no longer be me. I would be abandoning the life that I have. It would be a form of suicide. So even if it were technologically possible to put all the brain content onto a disk, put the disk into the machine now becomes the bearer of the content of my brain, I would, in doing that, whatever psychological satisfactions would be available, I would cease being a human being. I would cease being myself. It would be like committing suicide or signing up for the experience machine. I would not be living a human life.
Professor George, you said tonight that sexuality is integrated into the human life. Therefore, when the homosexual says, "It is who I am," how do we respond?
I am not my desires. Desires are aspects of myself. But I am not my desires. It's a mistake that students often make. They identify with their desires. Whether those desires are good or bad, they're not me. The real me is the master of my desires. All right? If I'm a slave to my desires, I'm the slave. It's not that I'm my desires. I'm the slave. So no matter, the real question always has to be, is this desire a desire for something that is humanly good and morally right? Something that is truly humanly fulfilling? Something that is for my integral good and the good of the communities that I belong to? That's got to be the question. That I have a desire is neither here nor there. It's how do I evaluate the desire? So I have to be able to stand back from my desires and be able to judge them with a view to mastering them. Now, if reason is not only to be the slave of the passions and may pretend to no office other than to serve and obey them, as Hume said, then there's no chance of being master of my desires. I just am my desires. And I should do what I really want to do. And the way to live a real life is to just follow my desires, do what I want to do. But I think Hume's just fundamentally wrong about it. It's my reason. That's what's fundamental. And that's what stands in judgment over my desire. I can control my desires. There are many, many same-sex attracted people who judge same-sex sexual relations, or any non-marital, who are conservative, who share my convictions about sexual morality. They struggle with temptation, but so do I, and so do you, and so do all of us. They try and very, very often succeed in being masters of their desires. They don't have to act on them just because they're their desires. I mean, I am male or female. And depending on your views about sex change operations, there's not much I can do about that. But that's not a desire, that's a fact about me. My sexuality is not my desires. My sexuality is my male or female identity. Now, what I do with that is a matter of judgment. How I shape my desires, the impact of my reason on my desires, that's really up to me. So whether one is same-sex attracted or not, whether one is male or female, whether one has a strong sex drive or only a weak sex drive, whether one experiences strong temptation, as many heterosexual males do, to use pornography or engage in immoral sexual practices. None of that is central to the identity of the person. What is central to the identity of the person is the character of the person, which is shaped by the choices of the person, which must be made in the light of one's best judgment. That's all conscience is. I mean, conscience is not some special faculty, independent of one's reason. It's one's last best judgment, informed by faith and reason, as to what I must do and what I must not do. And it's living in conformity with a properly informed conscience that is what shapes my real identity. That's who I am.
Professor George, Doctor of Jurisprudence. What do you say to the argument that law is the source of rights, and law comes from the government and the state? The law comes from the government and or the statutes of the Constitution.
Okay. Yeah. Martin Luther King asks in the letter from Birmingham jail, is the positive law of the state the ultimate criterion of right and wrong? Or is there a higher law that holds the positive law under judgment? Is there a moral law in light of which the positive law can be criticized? Dr. King, entirely rightly, in line with the great tradition of Western thought going all the way back to Socrates, not just Christian, but Jewish, classical, Dr. King concludes that there is a law above the positive law, in the light of which we can judge the positive law to be just or unjust. And that while we must obey the positive law and honor the rule of law and honor the legitimate rulers, we may not honor the moral law we may not honor the positive law that they made when it is in conflict with the moral law in a serious way or requires us to do something immoral. If the law were the source of our rights, then the segregation law would be legitimate. Martin Luther King and the rest of our African American brothers and sisters would have, as a moral matter, had to bow before the system of Jim Crow and racial oppression that they were born into. There would be no such thing as human rights. What would we say to Hitler, or Stalin, or Pol Pot? The whole idea of human rights presupposes that there is a moral law in the light of which we should shape our positive law. And when our positive law is out of whack with the moral law, that our allegiance has to be to the moral law. That's why we conclude the Manhattan Declaration by pledging together that while we will be the best of good citizens, while we will obey the law whether we like the law or don't like the law, so long as the law is just, whether we would have supported that law or not, we will not honor the positive law where the positive law is profoundly unjust or requires us to do something that is unjust and in violation of our conscience. In fact, the very conclusion of the Manhattan Declaration is that we will ungrudgingly render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, but under no circumstances will we render unto Caesar that which is God's. By God's will we render.
Robert George, you are a professor at Princeton University, and you are a co-author of the Manhattan Declaration. What advice would you give to current college undergraduates who are surrounded by authorities, their professors, who propose values and principles that are absolutely contrary to what you've been proposing this evening?
I grew up in West Virginia. I have the banjo to prove it. Bill's heard me, Dr. Hurwitz heard me play it. I didn't, my real coming of age wasn't in the 60s. I was a little too young, but it was in the early 70s. But it doesn't matter because the 60s in West Virginia happened in the early 70s. We're always a little, things come a little late to the hills.